Good afternoon and welcome to CSC Gurukul lecture in continuation with the series on sociology of religion. In today's lecture, we are trying to understand the contribution of Malinowski, Bronislaw Malinowski, to the understanding of myths. Myths as a part of the religion, because every religion, whether it be Hinduism, Christianity, Islam, has a whole lot of myths which can also help us to understand that tradition. So let us understand what Malinowski means by myths and its significance in the primitive society. Here let us kind of understand as an introduction that Malinowski was an anthropologist who did a participant observation among the Trobriand Islanders, which is in New Guinea, and tried to understand the culture. His approach was to understand the universal in particular, and he takes a functionalist approach to understand the functions of religion in the primitive society. So with this understanding, let us understand myths. So when we look into his understanding, Malinowski was the first to use scientific or anthropological understanding of myth, because prior to Malinowski, there was not any scientific study. So what he does is he makes an effort to investigate the savage myth, that is the way in which the number of myths was an integral part of the primitive society. And he makes an effort to make generalization and draw conclusion about circumstances in higher civilization and understand the cultural function of myth. So as we know that he was kind of doing a study of a specific society, he kind of finds out through his research and then kind of arrives at certain generalization, that is features that would be more or less found in other society. So what was myth actually for Malinowski? So he says that myth is a reflection of the society. So it is not to be understood independent. Any particular myth, when we look into the myth, has a lot to say about that society, the composition, the structure, the norms, values. Therefore, his advice was that it has to be understood within the realm of culture and not as independent. When we look into the relation between anthropology and myth, Malinowski says that anthropology should be more than just the study of primitive customs in light of our own mind and culture. That is, again, this is the tradition of anthropology as it was developing as a scientific body of discipline, that most of the time the effort was to study the other culture from the perspective of the West, which was then kind of a little kind of raised into a hierarchy where a comparison was done. And what was considered in the West was obviously ranked higher than what was found in the East. So it was said that the Western culture is more modern, and in comparison, then the primitive culture was considered as kind of non-modern or traditional. So that is kind of not always the correct path. What we can do is study our own culture with reference to the primitive society. So that will help us to kind of arrive at more rational, logical understanding. So, and that for how do we do that? In order to understand our own with the help of the other, we have to spend time in understanding the culture, the life of simple society, and that is where participant observation becomes handy. So we stay among the people, they perceive their society not from our own perspective but from their. Now try to understand what we do with reference to their norms and values, their institutions, their belief customs. And that is why he applied this method to understand the myth in the primitive society. What is myth? According to Malinowski, myth is a symbolic narrative, usually of unknown origin and at least partly traditional, that helps us to relate with actual event, and that especially associated with religious belief. So as I already started the lecture by saying that every tradition, every religion has a body of myth, And what does it tell us? It tells us about an event about something that happened in the past, which necessarily has no time. It may need not necessarily know when it started, but it helps us to tell us something about that tradition, about that culture and society. It consists of people assumed knowledge. So, a lot of assumption is there because there are no historical date, there are no historical evidence toward it. So, it's based on assumptions about the universe. And here, basically, in religion or religious tradition, much of the myth is around the interaction between the nature and the supernatural world. So, it is also defined as specific account of gods or superhuman beings involved in extraordinary events. So, if we look into Hinduism, there are a lot of myths which tells us about the power or the strength that the certain figure had, and they were able to kind of with that power overcome the danger or something which we say the truth always won, and they were able to kind of have a victory over the false. So, that is what was predicted. What was a norm of the culture was always kind of visualized as being the correct path, and you was trying to portray that norm through the action of a superhuman being. Now, we have myths and again we have mythology. So, there is a difference between myth and mythology. Each religion has its own symbol and myths. Mythology denotes both the study of the myth and the body of myth belonging to a particular religious tradition. So, we have Hindu mythology, which will specifically tell us about the stories of the power and success of human beings within Hindu tradition. So, you have full of Hindu mythology. So, the mythology is specific to a religious tradition. Myths could be found in any religion. So, if we have certain myths of about any religion, suppose about Hindu religion, then it will be considered as Hindu mythology. Now, when we look in mythology, as we already said, that there is a lot of assumptions. There is no concrete date or time of the occurrence of that event. So, we also does not mean that it is something which is of not significance. It has a literary aspect, that is, it is also something which is part of the cultural force, or rather above the cultural force. It has a narrative, it has a story, and this is kind of the narrative of the story is the literary aspect. So, it is not only in the oral tradition that myths are kind of existing, it is also in the written tradition that we kind to find a lot of myths. Myths lack human emotions as mere sociological precedents. Legal title, vindication of lineage, and the local claims do not lead far into the realm of human emotions. Now, when we make a distinction between myths and mythology, we also make a distinction between myth and belief, because the myth is also kind of helping us that there is a belief, on a story or a kind of a narrative. So, what is the distinction between myth and belief? Malinowski attempted to prove in his work that myth is above cultural forces, but it is not only this. Myth has a narrative with literary aspect. Myth has been used in epics, romance and tragedy by creative intellect of the people. Now, we look into a lot of myths. Some of the myths are about the kind of conjugal relation between a man and a woman. It also tells us a lot about the kind of tragedy of a creative intellect. It also tells us a lot about the wars, the violence between two sets of individuals. So, there are different kinds of myths, and which is kind of full. If we look into the distinction between myth and belief, we say some myths have brief connections. So they are not kind of very elaborate. It kind of not necessarily have some kind of persona or some kind of dramatic incident which will be able to relate to the story and the myth, whereas beliefs kind of have dramatic stories. So, if we look into this, myth does not lend far into the realm of human emotions. it is not necessarily that it is talking about the actual emotions among the people. It could be beyond that. Belief is closely associated with the deepest desire of man. Myth, meanings humans are told about the myth which they haven't lived, thus no emotion. So, many a time when certain myths are told or handed down, because it falls into two different time period or two different kind of different context altogether, the person listening or reading the myth is not always able to relate to it. So, one is not able to relate it to it, you will not be able to connect through your emotions, because you have not lived it, you have not been a part of it. So, there is a kind of a disconnect, there is less kind of no emotion involved. Whereas belief is something that connects human with their desire. How will you believe, kind of have a belief? Only when you have lived that experience and you have personally been kind of part of it. That helps you to develop your belief. Now, when we look into myth, and we said that it has a literary element, but for Malinowski, myth has a cultural force. And that is why it is very important to document and kind of understand myths, because it has a cultural context, and it is a kind of not only a narrative, it's not like something which was written by an author, unseen person. Many a time it is a depiction of the life in the context in which it is kind of is constructed or is formed. The ideas, emotions and desires associated with a given folklore or story are experienced not only when the story is told, but also when certain customs, moral, rule, rituals proceeding or counterpart of the story is enacted. So, myth is not only when we listen to it is kind of a narrative or a story, it does not end there. Many of our time we see that what these narratives tells us helps us to kind of organize the rituals. So, it is kind of handed down from one generation to the other, and every society kind of goes back to the original story in order to organize their ritual and moral life. Myth is a statement of primeval reality which still lives in present day life. So, it is something, there a lot of assumption, but then people take it for kind of that it did exist in some point of time in the past, and it is, but does not mean that it kind of is negated. So many of times it is a myth, it is not a fact. Why? Because it's something which is not has a evidence. So myth is kind of labeled as unrational or unscientific because it cannot be proved as evidence, but it is an important element of everyday present life. It carries forth from past to the present life. It is neither a mere narrative, nor a form of science, nor a branch of art or history, not an explanatory tale. So, this kind of tells us about the ambiguity on how we kind of make sense of what is a myth. So, what is, when we look into the cultural force, myth is a constant byproduct of living faith, which is in need of miracles of sociological status, which demands precedent, or moral role which requires sanction. Myth is indispensable ingredient of all culture. So, every society, every culture will have some amount of myth, because obviously society is coming over a period of time, on a long period of time. Everything is not necessarily scientific, logically explained and documented. Lot of things which happened in the past are kind of comes to us in forms of myth as narratives, and that is why Malinowski says that myth is indispensable ingredient, and it is constantly regenerated. Many a time there is a lot of change in the perspective, change in the way, because it's handed down from one to the other, changes are happening, so it is getting regenerated. Malinowski, in his understanding of myth, kind of critiques two theory which existed prior to his doing work. The first theory that he critiques is that myth is extravagantly emotional rendering of natural phenomena. So, you are kind of emotionally attached to any particular phenomena. So, you kind of develop lot of narratives which then gets transformed into myth. This is the first theory. And the second theory is Andrew Lang, who is a psychologist, and he mentions that myth is essentially an explanation, a sort of primitive science. So, because they did not have a well developed body of science, what they did was have some explanation of why certain natural phenomena exist the way they do. So, they developed a sort of explanation for this. So, that was termed as myth. Now, between the myth and nature, two links are interpolated. Malinowski shows that neither the mental attitude are dominant in primitive society, nor any of these can explain the primitive society's social context. So, we cannot all the time say that myth is emotional, and at the same time we cannot renegate it as something which is outside everyday experience. When he critiques the theories, Malinowski believes that the element of explanation and of interest in nature must be found in sacred legend. Only then it will be legitimately accepted by the society. The interest in nature, the importance of mythology of magic, and magic links to the economic concerns of man. So, if we look into it, what Malinowski is telling us that it has a literary element because there are a lot of narratives. Beyond that, it is an element of culture because it has to do with everyday life, everyday experience. It is a connect between the past and the present, and most important is that it is also connected to the economic and political realm of the society. So, that kind of explains the significance of myth. When we look to savage myth, that is the myth among the primitive society, and science of myth. So, the work done on savage myth, primitive myth, states that the study of mythology is drawn from the material of higher civilization. These material sources are derived from isolated literary text, no actual life settings, no social context, and that is why they are many a time not counted as science. The science of myth in living higher culture. So, one is those myth which is found among the primitive people where there is the kind of lack of documentation. So, could be referred to the myth among the civilized society, and that is the science of myth where you have kind of cultures like India, Japan, China, where you kind of use your scientific method, your comparative method, and you kind of study the existence and practice of myth. Malinowski, in his study of the myth in the primitive society, classifies two types of myth. One, he says, are simple myths that do not have any nexus or dramatic incident to prove its credibility. They are just kind of a certain assumption which has been handing down from one generation to other, certain assumption about certain basic everyday life. So, they are kind of no factual evidence about these incidents. And the second type of myth is myths that are supposed to be eminently dramatic stories, like the myth of the love or the myth of cano magic and the overseas selling. So, these are kind of lot of focus on certain dramatic, So, if you look into Christianity, we have the whether we kind of call it, but there is kind of story which tells us about Adam and Smith, so where the society originated. In Hinduism, we have the three ideals which was considered as the originator of the society. So, these are a lot of dramatic stories which tells us about the origin of the society or the functioning of the society. Now, let us look into the characteristics of myth. So, we said that it is neither a mere narrative, it is not just some kind of narrative which someone just handed down. It does not fall into the category of science, neither does it fall into the branch of art and history. So it is again what I said earlier, it is a little the characteristic or how we understand what is myth is ambiguous. But without even kind of categorically saying what is myth, we cannot kind of negate its existence. That is for sure that whether it be primitive society or civilized society, myth was a part of everyday life. And that is, it existed because it performed certain functions, and functions are sui generis, closely connected with the nature of tradition and the continuity of culture. So whether myths kind of finds a specific context, its existence is a kind of sui generis, and there is a continuity from the past to the present. And with with the relation between age and youth, with the human attitude towards the past. Now let us look into the functions of myth in primitive society. So for first function of myth is that it strengthens the tradition and endow with greater value by tracing back to higher, better, more supernatural reality of initial events. So what is basically is that it strengthens the origin or the genesis when times of time when people will have a very strong idea of how the tradition or the society kind of came into being, how it also helps you kind of have certain kind of positivity that people in the past were really brave, they were kind of really heroes, and they were able to kind of maintain the society. So it sets a lesson for the present to do the same. So it is indispensable. It's not that one can do without it. It is indispensable ingredient of all culture. The important thing is that it is undergoing change. It's constantly regenerating, and historical changes creates its mythology. So they are kind of in a society because myths are indispensable. So there will be a number of myths. So together into a tradition, not one myth but multiple myths, they together kind of creates a mythology or a scientific study of the myth. Now what is very important is what Malinowski wants to tell us is that myth is an indispensable element of all culture. It is found in all society, whether we talk about the savage society or the civilized society. And therefore, from anthropological perspective, it is very important that we have a significant way or a method for the study of myths. And what is that method? He says that the new method should be adopted while studying the science of folklore, as it can be seen that they do exist in dependence to ritual, sociology and material culture. And to do so, folk tales, legends and myth must be lifted from the flat existence on paper and placed in the three-dimensional reality of full life. So, many a time people kind of consider it as an assumption, as something which people thought of it, but nobody is kind of exploring it. So, we need to kind of take it out from the book view and put it into the field view, kind of explore whether what has been talked about the myth is correct or not. So Malinowski suggests that some changes in regard to anthropological fieldwork, where he emphasis on adopting a new method for collecting evidences. And many a time when we are collecting, information from the primitive society, what he suggests is that we don't go to the field with already of assumption about certain thing, that this is a myth and this is not reality. We need to go there and kind of find the everyday functioning of the life in terms of whether these functioning are as it has been documented or not. The cultural practice of the myth has to be documented, and this will help us to explore the myth. So myths are element of everyday life, whether we talk about rituals or we talk about religious tradition, and so it becomes an important element of religion. So until and unless the myths are studied and documented, the understanding or the study of religion will not be complete, and that is what he is talking about. When we look into the study that he did among the Trobrianders, we see he's kind of giving us instances of lot of myths which were concerned about the interaction of human beings with nature and natural sources, myths about the everyday life, myths about nature, myths about supernatural belief. So it becomes important to document these myths and arrive at a more anthropological study. Malinowski advises that anthropologists need to go outside, observe the activities and custom, to go on expedition to collect data based on what they themselves have witnessed and not to rely on hearsay. So this is very important from an anthropologist perspective, that we need to kind of not stop by just reading a text or just listening to it, that this is something which is kind of a myth. How do we know whether it is a myth or it is representing the reality? That is possible only when one goes to the field and does a kind of very close residence with the respondent, does an ethnographic study, not from your own perspective but from the perspective of the respondent, understand the culture, understand the norms, and then arrive at a more actual understanding. So only when we do a anthropological study of through participant observation, anthropologists will be able to give a all-round vision of primitive man and primitive culture. So we can conclude by saying that Malinowski was emphasizing on the new method. That is the time when anthropology was just emerging. His focus was on participant observation to study savage folklore, mythology and culture. He emphasized on fieldwork as he believed only such anthropology can give us a holistic understanding. And he gives credit to James Frazer and discusses his work that establishes the intimate relation between the world and the deed in primitive. So you have to connect what has been heard about the primitive type in terms of what is actually the way out. So he has shown that words of story and spells of rituals, ceremony are two aspects of primitive belief. He emphasizes the importance of words as it helps articulate a thought and thus a cultural achievement and advantage. So by looking into this in terms of what is myth, how anthropologists study myths, the characteristics and type, we are able to understand Malinowski's ideas on myth in primitive society. With this, I come to an end of today's lecture. Thank you.